Hello, hello, and very happy new year. It's been a minute since I've seen you all. My holiday season is always very busy. I'm a very personalized gift giver. I always end up doing a lot of crafts and making stuff for the holidays. So it's always really busy for me. So I haven't given you guys a reading update since October. So today we're going to go through all of the books that I read in November and December and how I finished up my year of reading and what I'm planning to get into in the new year. As usual, my statistics in this video will be pretty general, and this is going to be more about me discussing my thoughts and feelings on all of the books I read. But if you're really interested in the statistics portion, that will all be included in my reading journal video, which will hopefully be coming next week. I'm almost all the way caught up on it again because I have so many things to do for my reading journal at the end of the year, so I always end up getting a little bit behind. But let's get into all of the books that I read in November and December. In November, I ended up reading 3 books, and then I read 4 books in December, but my books in December were a little weird. We'll get into that at the very end of the whole reading wrap-up portion. But I read about half and half digital and audio. I didn't read any physical books in November and December, which was unfortunate. The physical book that I had been reading since October, I did finish at the very beginning of the month, this month, but I didn't end up finishing it in November and December. So in November, I read 1 digital book and 2 audiobooks, and then in December, I read 1 audiobook and 3 digital books. So that's kind of the general breakdown of my reading. The first book I ended up reading in November, I talked about it a little bit in my October wrap-up because I had actually finished it by the point that I filmed that, but that is When the Tides Held the Moon by Venessa, Vida, Kelley. This is a pretty genre crossover kind of book. It is, I would categorize the main genre as historical romance, and then it has a fantasy element to it because one of the main characters, one of the love interests, is a merman. So mostly historical romance, but it does have a bit of that paranormal romance / fantasy element to it as well. We follow our main character, who is Puerto Rican, and he has moved to New York City because all of his family has died, and he's trying to find work, and he works at a iron working factory and is tasked with making this huge cage on wheels. None of the people that are working know what it's for. They just know it's a really big job and no one else thinks they can do it. And so our main character kind of gets stuck doing it and ends up doing a really fantastic job. And they find out it is for a carnival kind of thing. And so they show them the cage and they ask our main character to come help them capture this merman. He doesn't think that it's ever going to be anything, but they do indeed capture the merman. And our main character goes to actually work at the carnival instead of staying at the ironworks and becomes kind of their security guard, and also is in charge of making sure that the merman is taken care of, and they form a connection and fall in love, and the story proceeds from there. I ended up really enjoying this book while I was reading it, but the longer that I sat with it, the more I kind of found little issues that I had with it. I still did really enjoy it and do recommend it. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, and I think it's a pretty strong debut. And I'll definitely check out other works by this author. I especially really liked, I think this author, they are a artist by trade, so there's a bunch of really beautiful illustrations in the book, and I really, really loved those. But I just had a couple of issues, mostly with the pacing of the story. It feels quite drawn out. Our main character, trying to avoid spoilers, kind of knows what the right thing to do is and knows what he should be doing, but doesn't get around to doing it for a very long time. So there's kind of a 30-ish% of the book that is kind of feels really stagnant because you know what the main character should do. The main character knows what he should do, but he doesn't end up doing it. So that was a little bit weird to me that the pacing was so drawn out in just that aspect. I also did wish that we got like a little more buildup in the romance between our main character and the merman. They kind of go from like obviously not really liking each other, especially on the merman's end. They like kidnapped him basically. But they go from not totally liking each other to being like really into each other and having these really deep conversations kind of quickly. It doesn't seem like there is like a lot of bridge between the two opposites. So I wish we would have gotten a little bit more build up in that aspect. I think where this book really shines is obviously in its diversity and representation of all different kinds of people. You have our main character who is Puerto Rican and gay, and then he also has asthma. So there's disability rep in there as well. And then he ends up having like a found family vibe with a bunch of the other members of this carnival. They're all different ethnicities and they all have different things about them. There's another queer couple. There's a couple actually in those characters. And then there's a couple different disabilities in there as well. So I think that really shines through. And I think that was really nice to see, especially since this is like a historical setting. I also did see the I don't know if it was a plot twist because I feel like it wasn't super well like obscured. I think it wasn't too hard to see where the end of this book was going. But I did see where it was going from a pretty early standpoint. And I don't know that I loved the way that it was executed was my only gripe with that, really. I don't really care about seeing plot coming. So I don't usually have too much of an issue with that, but I just had an issue with the way it was executed because it does, trying not to get into spoilers, it does kind of fall into the like magical disability trope almost, which I felt slightly weird about the fact that it was like teetering right on the edge of doing that and not doing that. So overall, I really enjoyed it and I really loved the characters. I think they're the really strong point of this story. But there was, again, a couple of things that I had issue with. Specifically, the pacing was my biggest issue, I think. And then I just wanted a little bit more out of the romance buildup. Wanted a little more tension and yearning before we just got straight into it, I guess. But 3.5 stars. Will definitely be picking up other works by Venessa, Vida, Kelley whenever they publish more. So that's the first book that I ended up reading in the past 2 months. After that, I read White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. This is a nonfiction collection of essays that deals with how white women take advantage of the patriarchy but still expect to be treated as if they're not, essentially. The patriarchy will always honor the whiteness of white women's skin, and this just basically talks through how if you don't deconstruct that and try to like actively mitigate the harm from that, then you're not only taking advantage of the patriarchy, but also like constantly a victim of it, even though you're taking advantage of it. I'm not explaining this super well. Definitely go give it a read. I think this goes in a really good like intersection of a bunch of books that I've read within the past couple of years. I think that this goes very, very well with They Were Her Property, which I read, I think, last year, and it is referenced in this book. So I think those pair really well together. And then I also think Cast is kind of like an interesting intersection as well, because it deals with a similar discussion as this does, but kind of in a different context. So I think, I've just been reading a lot of books that kind of like are a very good curriculum on this topic. So I always enjoy reading other books that like change my perspective on that a little bit, and get me to see things in a bit of a different way, even if it is the same kind of overall topic. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars just because the personal impact wasn't super high to me. And there was a couple of the chapters where it felt like we were like going back and forth between 2 points a lot. So I thought that could have been organized marginally better. And then just, one of the I have like a whole rating system that I do for all my books. And one of the items for nonfiction is personal impact. And since I have been reading a lot on this topic, the personal impact of this book wasn't as high as when I first started out getting into this topic, but still pretty high. So those were the only couple of things that brought my star rating down a little bit. Very highly recommend, and very highly recommend checking out a couple of those other books. I'll say Hood Feminism is also another one that goes along with these, and then Mediocre is kind of also in the intersection of that, but that talks more about like how allowing the mediocrity of white men to be considered amazing is hurting literally everyone in society. So those like collection of books all kind of go together, and I think they all bring something new to the table, which is really great. And then the last book I ended up reading in November was The Berry Pickers by Amanda Peters. This is a literary fiction book, and I adored this. This isn't really any spoilers, but if you want to go into this book completely blind, I guess I'll just say it's a really good book, and the way that it explores its themes is really brilliant, and the way that the point of views mirror each other in this book and show how trauma kind of intersects with different people, even if you are raised completely separately, based on like sharing an event or a history. All of those were really incredibly done, and I also really liked the writing style of this. So if you want to go into it completely blind, that's my very succinct thoughts. But the synopsis gives this plot point away, so it's not really spoilers. This book is about, it follows a family, essentially, of Indigenous people, and when they are at a farm in Maine for the summer, which they always go there to pick berries. That's one of the ways that they make money, is they travel down there in the summer and pick berries and then go back home in the fall. While they're down at the farm one summer, the youngest sister in the family goes missing. And so from the synopsis, you know this, and very early in the story, it's like within the first 2 chapters. One of our POVs is the second youngest child, the brother that was the last person to see the youngest sister. And then the other POV is actually the youngest sister, and it chronicles she got taken by a white woman who couldn't have kids and takes her home and like raises her as her own kid. So you follow both of those POVs throughout their lives from that event to the end of the book. And I think this book was just so beautifully executed. I really, really enjoyed it. I think, again, I said this before I got into the synopsis at all, but the way that the 2 POVs, they have such mirrored trauma, even though our main character, she doesn't remember ever being part of this family. She was taken when she was so young that all she remembers is being a part of this family that she lives in for the rest of her life. And so the way that their like feelings and thoughts and traumas mirror each other, even though this woman doesn't even know that like where this is coming from or why she feels this way all the time, is really, really interesting. And I think it just does such a beautiful job of exploring generational trauma, because you can see how she's impacted by things that she like doesn't really even remember or know happened to her. And I think it's also really interesting to see the ways that they kind of have different life experiences, but kind of end up in a similar place. And I just really, really enjoyed it. And I loved the way that this was structured. I loved the writing style. I loved the way the themes were explored. I loved the themes that the author chose to explore. Just everything about this book I really, really enjoyed. And I'm so glad that I picked it up. It was definitely my favorite read of the month. And I very highly recommend if you're into literary fiction at all. So those are the 3 books that I ended up reading in November. Getting into December, the first book that I read in December was A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping by Sangu Mandana. This is the second book that Sangu Mandana has published. The first is A Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which I read last year and for the most part enjoyed. I had a couple of issues with the way that the relationship developed. and I felt like there was kind of a really fast switch up at the end. So I had a couple of issues with that, and I thought that this took place in the same like larger world but was completely disconnected from the first one, but it actually does not take place in the same world. It just has kind of a similar, very broad premise of like, what if witchcraft existed in our world? But the first one is more like all the witches keep to themselves and they're not really allowed to interact with each other. And they kind of have to like keep their magic a secret. This one, there is like a very structured society that is kind of like in charge of regulating the witches, and there's like a whole community of them and everything. So they are definitely in different worlds, but kind of a very similar broad premise. And this one follows our main character, who is like very promising young witch and is being trained by the like chancellor of this society when she's very young. But she lives with her aunt. Her parents kind of just like abandoned her and left because they wanted to adventure and didn't really want to be parents. So she lives with her aunt, and she, at the very beginning of the book, her aunt dies and she finds her in the garden and she's like, oh my God, I'm like a kid. I can't live without my aunt. And this random talking fox appears and tells her how to bring her aunt back from the dead. So she does, but at the same time, she loses like 90% of her magical ability and she gets kicked out of the society. She can't be trained anymore. This is like a forbidden spell that she wasn't supposed to use, but she didn't know that. And so that's the very start of the book. And then we very quickly travel to like very many years later, where our main character is much older and she has kind of this like sour outlook on life. She has to deal a lot with the grief of like losing all of her promise and the life that she thought that she was going to have as a kid, and dealing with that and coming to like accept herself as a person and not just as her magical abilities. And there's a very found family vibe. There are a lot of quirky people that are staying at this inn. The main character, she casts a spell. I think it's before her aunt that whole situation happens, but basically you'll only be able to find the inn if you have like good intentions and if you really need to be there. And so there's kind of like a quirky, odd collection of people that live here with her at the inn that she takes care of and runs. And our male main character stumbles across this inn with his little sister. They were at the society and he determines that that's not really the best place for her. So he's trying to find where the best place for his little sister is. And they come across this inn, and the main character and him begin kind of like training the little sister together in her magical prowess, and fall in love from there. And also at the same time, our main character is trying to get her magical powers back. She has discovered that there is a way that she can get them back, but they have to find all of the different spell components and everything like that. So they're working together in a couple of different ways, and the relationship and story progressed from there. And I really, really loved this. I ended up giving this 5 stars. I liked this better than The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which is not a universal consensus. I've seen a lot of people that like The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches better than this. But I think this just, in my opinion, felt like it had more of a solid identity. It knew more what it wanted to be. The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, it felt like it was much more based on like the vibes than this one is. This one does still have those very immaculate vibes and the very beautiful atmosphere that Sangu Mandana was able to kind of craft in her first book. But this one just felt like it knew more what themes it wanted to explore and knew more how to explore those themes, whereas the first one felt a bit more like it knew what themes it wanted to explore, but it kind of just like followed tropes more. This one definitely felt more unique and more sure in its identity than the other one did. So I ended up liking this one more. I think that the ending was a very beautiful way to end the story based on all of the things that our main character goes through. And I just really enjoyed it. And I will forever read anything else that Sangu Mandana writes because I've enjoyed both of these a lot. So that is the first book that I ended up reading in December. And now we're into the slightly weird other books that I read in December. So these are the collectively, these three books are the second installment in the New Haven series, which is an interconnected romance series that follows a bunch of different characters that live in this fictional town in South Carolina, I believe. The first book I read, I want to say 3 years ago, and I really, really loved that book. I thought that the theme exploration and the romance were very beautiful in that book. And this is collectively the second book in this installment, but there are 3 separate books. So that's something that I've never experienced before. They all follow the same couple through a 10-year period of them going through their relationship. And I think overall I enjoyed, but I think by the third book, I was quite done with this story being extended so long. I definitely think there was a way to combine the second and third books, and I think I would have enjoyed it more if it had been just 2 installments instead of 3, because these are not short books either. The first and last book are over 400 pages, and then the middle one is almost 300. So I don't know that I needed 1,000 pages of a romance of one couple. I definitely would have preferred if this had been shrunken down into 2 installments. Again, because by the third book, I was just get on with it. You guys should just be together at this point. And also, I felt like the third book was a little strange in that it felt like the characters kind of became caricatures of themselves in a weird way, where it felt like they lost a lot of the complexity that they had in the first and second book in order to fulfill the end intention of them being together by the end of the book. So yeah, overall, as a reading experience, I think that this was a very intriguing idea, and I've definitely never read anything that's like this before, where it's so many books following one couple. But I don't know that it was executed in the best way. I guess for giving an explanation of what these books are about, the first book follows the main characters when they're in college, and obviously they don't end up together at the end of the first book. They don't get together until the third book for finally, but or they're together, but they don't have their happily ever after until the third book, if that makes sense. But they are in college. They're part of the same friend group. The FMC has always had a crush on the MMC, but has never said anything about it. And then one night at a party, her best friend dares them on a game of truth or dare to kiss, and things spark and fly from there. And they end up dating, all of this stuff. They both have a lot of trauma in their pasts that I think these books, specifically the first and second book, do a really good job of exploring and kind of breaking down and seeing why these two work so well together and why they complement each other so well. So the first book is them in college. The second book is them, I want to say 5 years after college. And then the last book is actually, no, the second book is 7 years after college. And then the last book is 2 years after the second book. I think as far as the books themselves are concerned, the second book was my favorite to read. The relationship dynamic between those two, I think, is the best in the third book. And you can really see why these two work so well together. Like I've mentioned a couple times, by the third book, it felt like the dynamic was getting a little flattened and the characters were getting flattened as well because we were dragging this out for so long. And then the first one, they're kind of kids, so they're figuring out how to communicate with each other and be in relationships. Both of them are kind of new to being in relationships. So I liked the relationship dynamic of the second one the best, but I think the premise of the second one is kind of iffy. And also, I just have to say, the way that the first book ends, I cannot believe that there's 2 more books after this, because I find what happens at the end of the first book to be unforgivable, and I don't really know how they moved past this. It's kind of astounding to me that they did move past this. So yeah, just a little bit of a mixed bag with this one. Overall, I did enjoy my reading experience, but it was a little weird to say the least. So I ended up giving the first 2 installments in this 4 stars, and then the last installment was 3 stars. Overall enjoyed, but just really could have been condensed, I think, and used a little more fine tuning. I ended up reading these actually because Restore Me, which is the first one, I never even said the name of these books. They're called Revive Me, and then it's like part 1, part 2, part 3, the different parts. The first book in this series, Restore Me, and then I think also these, like everything in the New Haven series. But Restore Me I think it just got published a few days ago, actually. But they got picked up by a traditional publisher. They were indie published, and they're getting like special edition republished, trad publishing. So I think Restore Me came out Tuesday this week, and then Revive Me will get republished as well. I think that the book deal was for 9 books, and I believe right now there is 4 stories in this series, including this like 3-book part. So 6 books in the series? So I think there's going to be 3 more in the series. But there's only 4 of them are out right now. But I think they're all getting trad published within the next couple of years, I would say. I don't know that they're all going to be done this year, probably because there's so many of them. But the trad published version of Restore Me looks really, really beautiful. And I'm really happy for this author because I did really, really love the first one, and I did overall enjoy this one. So that's exciting. And that is kind of why I picked this up, because I saw the news about that and I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot about this series. I have to get back into it. So that is the other set of books that I ended up reading in December, and those were all digitally. So that is everything that I ended up reading at the end of the year. As you can see, I didn't quite reach my reading goal last year, but I am not really too particular about my numeric goals for reading usually. 72 is just kind of like where I usually fall, so that's always my goal every year. Sometimes I read quite a bit more, sometimes I read quite a bit less. It was almost around, so I ended up reading 70, and that is everything I read at the end of the year last year. So let's get into my hopefuls for January. I think I'm just going to talk about, in the past, I've read like the synopsis for every book on my TBR, and I'm kind of just tired of doing that. So I'm just going to talk about why each book is on my TBR instead, and go through all of them more quickly instead of trying to read the synopsis for everyone. So with that being said, the first 2 books on my January TBR are from my priority TBR, which if you want to see all of the books that are in my priority TBR, go check out my 2026 reading journal video. I go over what books are going in my priority TBR. There's 12 books in there, and then 1 books are going in my nonfiction TBR, and there's 12 books in there. So the first book on my TBR is from my priority TBR. The first 2 are kind of go together, and that is A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon and Among the Burning Flowers by Samantha Shannon. These are the 2 prequels to Priory of the Orange Tree. I read Priory of the Orange Tree in, I want to say 2021. And I just have not gotten around to reading either of the prequels. I mean, Among the Burning Flowers just came out like in October or something. So understandable that I haven't gotten around to that one, but A Day of Fallen Night has been out for a while, and it's been on my like 25 and 2025 and 24 and 2024. So it's been on my lists for a while, and I really just need to get around to reading it. It's just a very large book, very daunting. But I'm going to try and read both of those this month. So those are both on my physical TBR, and we'll see if this ends up happening, but I would really love to also reread Priory, because I remember like close to nothing about what happens in that book, and I'm very interested to see like what I think of Priory after having read both of the prequels. A Day of Fallen Night takes place like I want to say hundreds of years before Priory, and is kind of about the historical, mythical figures that are talked about in Priory. So they're more like the fantasy characters. Like if today there was a story and then the prequel was about like King Arthur, that kind of thing, where it's like this very historical, legendary figures is what A Day of Fallen Night is about. And then I believe Among the Burning Flowers is like shortly before Priory and has some of the characters from Priory in it. So that one's more of like a true prequel. And then A Day of Fallen Night is like a historical prequel kind of a vibe. So I'm curious to see if it changes my opinions of Priory at all to have read those two. I adored Priory. I gave it 5 stars, and it's like, I still think it's one of my favorites. I really loved it. So I don't know that it will change like my rating or anything, but I'm curious to see how my perspective changes on it. So we'll see. That is a very big stretch goal. I'm very likely not going to be able to do that because Priory and A Day of Fallen Night are both ginormous books. So we'll see if I'm able to fit that in January. And then my other 2 physical books that I am hopefully going to get through in January are The Princess Knight by Cait Jacobs. This was published last year, and this is, I'm going to pitch it as Legally Blonde meets The Princess Bride. It is a very like fantasy medieval kind of world, and it has a lot more world building in it. I've started already than I was expecting. It has a lot more like magic elements. I was kind of just expecting it to be like medieval theme, but it has an actual fantasy world around it and world building and different countries and magic and all that kind of stuff. So I'm really loving it so far. But the premise is very Legally Blonde. The main character in this, the princess, she has been kind of like unofficially betrothed to the prince of the neighboring kingdom for many, many years. They've developed a friendship. They're not really like romantically interested in each other, but they've developed a friendship. And at the beginning of this book, she is expecting him to come and propose to her. And instead of proposing, he says, "Hey, I think our whole entire continent, all of our countries, all of our kingdoms are about to go to war, and I need a warrior queen, not you, to be my queen," and doesn't propose and then leaves to go to this like warrior school. And so she's devastated, but her idea is to follow him to this warrior school and prove him wrong, that she can be a warrior queen. So that's one of our main characters. And then our other main character is the prince's best friend and the captain of his guard, who is also going to this warrior school with them. And he ends up helping the princess and helping to train her. And, romance ensues from there. So I'm having a really fun time with it so far. I think it's a very sweet so far, and I'm really excited to finish the rest of it. That one is just kind of like a whim pickup. It doesn't really have any reason behind why I'm reading it other than it sounds really fun. And then the other physical book is The Rules for Ghosting. And this is part of my traveling book club that is still going on. We kind of all took a bit of a hiatus in sending our books collectively over the summer. So we're just getting back into it. So that is the next book that I have for my traveling book club. I'm going to try really, really hard to get it read this month. It seems really sweet and queer and cute. I don't know a ton about it because, I have to read it either way. But a lot of the people in the traveling book club have been like, this was really, really good. I'm so glad you picked this, to the person that picked it. So hopefully I'll be able to read that and send that out in the mail by the end of the month. So those are my physical books that are on my TBR. As far as my digital books, I am hopefully going to read the last 2 books that are currently published from the New Haven series, which is Release Me and Reclaim Me, I want to say. I did already finish Release Me by the time I'm filming this, but I put it on my TBR at the beginning of the month, so we're going to talk about it a little bit. But they follow, 2 different couples. So I'm only settling in with a couple for one book this time, which I'm happy about. But in the same town, just following different characters. So I'm excited to read these. I think I will enjoy both of them more than Revive Me, but we shall see in my next video. I'm not going to talk about my thoughts on the one that I've finished yet. We'll do that in my January wrap up, but those are the books on my digital TBR. And then the only book that I have on my audio TBR at the moment is The Gates of Europe, which is my book for January for my nonfiction TBR. And this is just a history of Ukraine and kind of everything that's led up to the current situation that's going on. And I don't really know a ton about that, so I'm really interested to learn a lot about it. And for my nonfiction TBR, I kind of try to pick, books that are related to any history or heritage months that are going on. And January doesn't have one. So this one is just one that I picked that I've had on my TBR for a bit. So that is my nonfiction read for the month. And that is everything that I'm hoping to read in January. It's kind of a lot, especially after I've been having a bit of a slower reading time for like the past 6 months. But I feel very motivated to read all of these. So we'll see how I do. But that is everything I have. Thanks very much for watching. And I will see you again, hopefully next week, for all of my wrap up of the past 2 months in my reading journal and my setup for my January. But other than that, Happy New Year, and I'll see you again soon.